asking why and going deeper. Do you have a methodology there to where you will ask how first and then why second or anything like that?
So the first thing I do is I put up a set of words so that we can all be using terminology that we're agreeing on. And what does the choice mean? So we're talking about Burke's terministic screens in some way, right? We're talking about how the language we choose is creating the reality. So if I talk about illegal aliens, that's creating a very different reality than an undocumented worker. And my entire worldview will change. And if we can't understand how your worldview is being created by the words, we're not going to come in the middle. If we're using different words for the same thing, then that's going to have a material consequence in what happens with that thing that we're talking about. And then we can start talking about, well, why does it matter? Well, what happens if we do this? Well, what happens if we do that? What's the difference? Yeah. And we go into different directions as those conversations go.
I got really excited whenever you used the name Burke. Because that is like,
I love Burke. I love Burke.
That's a trigger word of happiness for me personally.
Yeah.
Because and you talked about terministic screens. Of course, we can the words that we choose select, deflect, and reflect reality, and and create a very different story, a very different narrative. And if we can't share a narrative, if we can't have a same shared story, it's very difficult to have meaningful, productive conversations that can lead to better policies for relating to our fellow humans, right? What are your other favorite Burkean themes or topics, and how have you seen those become useful with some of these modern issues?
I really love the pentad because what it does is it lets us highlight certain things as being important. And when I talk about it with my students, I do a cat's cradle to explain that if I pull this string gets tighter and this string changes in importance. And so if we can understand that if I'm putting emphasis over here, then I'm taking away emphasis over here. And how we understand rhetorical events really depends significantly on where I put that emphasis. And we play with that a little bit by looking at media stories. So I will have them look at a presidential story from the perspective of CNN and Fox News, really very different things, and have them do a Burkean analysis of that and think about, okay, well, where is CNN putting the emphasis? And where's Fox News putting the emphasis? And that gets us into language too, because always the language is a bit different. And it's really interesting to see them kind of wake up, not to the fact that they have different perspectives, because they already know that, but how they're doing it. It's a misnomer, and I tell my students is to think that as rhetorical scholars, we have to be objective, right? Just like reporters do not have to be objective. We just hope that their biases are well enough known that we know what we're getting. If the purpose of rhetoric is to uncover what is causing us to maybe see a more fragmented democracy and potentially destroy democracy, which I think is part of what rhetoric should be doing, then absolutely. To me, it would be really valuable to think through what are the things that are being said and why are they leading people to lean one way or the other. And I've heard, I think it was Dan Levy did a really great piece on understanding both sides in the political issue and how people talk about the other side and why that's creating the tensions that it's creating. And his whole point was about the language we use to talk about the other. And if I make you the other, and I make you not only the other, but the stupid other, or the greedy other, or the other who doesn't care about people, or the other who just, can't figure it out. I am creating language that is almost impossible to get through. Mm-hmm. But that's not the way it is. I think we all have people who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum from us. And we know that these are perfectly normal, rational human beings most of the time. So we know that language isn't true, but we adopt it. Like, if you don't agree with me, you're clearly a bad person. And to the point where some people are like, if you don't believe this, I want you off my feed right now, right? Yeah. Like, just unfriend me right this second. And there's no dialogue about, well, do you know why I believe that or what I think? Nobody changed their opinion by being told they're stupid, right? Nobody walked in and said, well, they said I'm really stupid and ignorant, so clearly I've got to change my opinion, right? That's just a way of shutting the door to anybody ever. In fact, that's what gets people to dig in. Say, wow, that's really interesting. I would love to know what you found, and I'd love to talk about it. And then look at the source, read it, right? Going back to what we said before, read the stuff you're saying is misinformation, and say, oh, I can see where you'd think that. I'm really interested in the study they did, though, because it doesn't seem to be peer-reviewed, or the data doesn't seem to fit. I'm wondering, where we could find something else on that. Challenge them to go down their own rabbit hole and find it. And she was like, but that's not as much fun. That's kind of where we go, right? Well, it's not fun to actually engage people and listen to them. It's much more fun just to love our position and fight for it. And it gets back to Burke, because you asked about Burke. I love Burke. Identification is one of his other really powerful concepts. And I tell people, in a lot of cases, I think identification is much more powerful than ethos, because most of the time we're really not interested in ethos. We let celebrities tell us all sorts of things. Identification, though, allows us to want to, so there's that identification of people we genuinely want to be like us. And then there's that identification of people who we know are never going to be like us, but we have that inspiration or that aspiration to be like them. And I think Burke does a really good job of talking about how we want to identify with very specific kinds of people. I tell people, just because somebody hasn't said something doesn't mean they don't think it and believe it. And so what you're doing is pushing them back into their echo chamber. So they won't talk about it in public, where you can sort of, pick up their idea and look at it and turn it around and get them to consider it in a room full of people. Instead, they're going to go into their Reddit, subreddit, and say the same thing to people who are going to reinforce, reiterate, validate. And that's the piece that makes me really, really nervous and uncomfortable, because eventually that little subreddit becomes a bigger Reddit and a bigger Reddit and bigger Reddit. And that's where you start to see some really horrible things coming to pass. So I would like to get to the point where we can pull people's language and rhetoric out of the darkness, invite people to have conversations, and know that they're not going to be socially ostracized for talking about things. I follow the Heterodox Academy. They do a lot of talking about these types of things to see if I can get some ideas about how to do that. I do the best that I can, but it's very challenging. Yeah.
If I have a belief that has withstood the test of time, and all of a sudden I'm being forced to look at that belief under a critical lamp and a critical lens, that can be a very scary thing that threatens my identity. And if my identity is threatened, I am going to shut down so much faster and shut the critical part of my brain off so much faster.